Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So glad to see all of you. Glad you could join us today for what I think is going to be a terrific conversation about a new book, Too Hot to Handle, The Politics of Sex Education. The title, Too Hot to Handle, A Global History of Sex Education by the author and our good friend, John Zimmerman. If you're not familiar and if you have not read his stuff, one of the nice things is when you actually get historians who write in ways that you want to read the history. And among John's many gifts is the fact that he's actually a terrific writer. Today's event's going to be simple. I'm going to introduce John. He's going to take a little bit of time to talk with you all about the book, about what's in it. We'll then have a little bit of time for a conversation, and then we'll open it up for folks in the audience to get a chance to chat with Jonathan. Jonathan Zimmerman is Professor of Education and History, as well as Director of the History of Education program at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at NYU. He's also the recipient of NYU's Distinguished Teaching Award, a former Peace Corps volunteer and high school teacher. This is Jonathan's fourth book. Some of his other books include is it your fifth book, bud? Fifth book, my apologies. Previous books include Small Wonder, The Little Red Schoolhouse, and History and Memory, which Jonathan was kind enough to join us here to talk about a number of years ago. Innocents Abroad, American Teachers in the American Century, and Who's America? Culture Wars in the Public Schools. He contributes routinely to national newspapers and magazines, like the New York Times and the Washington Post. He also appears every other week on WHYY, Philadelphia's national public radio affiliate. Those of you who are watching online today, the book is available on Amazon. For those of you who are with us, you'll find the book available in the foyer after the event. Also, the event will be available, obviously, on the AEI webpage going forward. So please feel free to share word with friends and colleagues. With that, Jonathan, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Rick. And for those of you who don't buy the book, you can always just wait for the movie. But they're never the same book and movie, right? We've all experienced that. Yeah. Rick mentioned I'm a former Peace Corps guy, and you may have read if you study the Kennedys that Sergeant Shriver, the brother-in-law of President Kennedy, was somewhat of a controversial figure in the family because his politics were very much to the left of most of the people, including JFK. And so his sobriquet, his nickname among the Kennedys, was the House Communist. And I've often wondered if that's what people call Rick Hess at AEI. Rick has been kind enough to feature me on his EduScholar thing, and I'm very proud to get a pretty high ranking, or so the people in my institution thought. The only person who thought my ranking wasn't high enough was my mother, who actually composed an angry letter to the AEI, which fortunately she didn't send, asking why it wasn't higher. But in a weird way, actually, this book is about my mom, because I know this is odd, but my mom was a sex educator and a family planning educator. And she imbued me with kind of the standard American liberals line about sex education, which was that the United States was somehow behind other countries, that is, other Western democracies who were somehow ahead of us. And actually, in the way that we all kind of end up symbolically slaying our parents, I discovered in this book that Mom was not correct. The United States was actually a pioneer in sex ed, and I think more interestingly, this image of being ahead or behind I found was invalid because the US and other democracies in Europe actually had different goals for sex ed. The image of a race implies that you have the same finish line, but I discovered that they didn't, which was another surprise in the book. I discovered that in the United States, sex ed was very much oriented towards public health, and especially preventing certain negative public health outcomes, especially unwanted pregnancy and STDs. Whereas in Europe, it's very much oriented towards the individual, and especially helping liberate the individual and helping the individual discover and determine their sexuality. And this I find fascinating because it also runs counter to so many other transatlantic comparisons that we tell, in which, the United States is all about the individual, and over there, they're all about the collectivity. I actually found the opposite here. The other surprises, briefly, was just how little sex ed there is. That was the hardest part of writing the book. The opening of the book is called The Century of School and the Century of Sex, because the 20th century was both. Schools became ubiquitous institutions around the world, and sex became ubiquitous in ways it never had been. New forms of sexual freedoms, expressions, configurations. But sex and school do not play nicely. And there's astonishing little sex ed around the world, even in places that liberal Americans often idealize as having lots of sex ed. This is why, friends, if you hear anybody on any part of the political spectrum say with great certainty that sex ed does X behaviorally, like people on the right saying it makes you have more sex, or people on the left saying, it makes you use condoms, you can pretty much write them off as an ideologue or a charlatan, because something that happens so little, it's really impossible to show a strong behavioral effect like that. And I think the other takeaway of the book, which I find the most interesting, frankly, is that sex ed has actually become more contested, more problematic, and more limited because of this thing called globalization. I think a lot of people invoke that word, assuming in a pretty facile way that globalization is going to yield whatever they want. But actually, often it doesn't. So sex ed is a global phenomenon, but so is the opposition to sex ed. And in some ways, that opposition has been stronger. So just very briefly, I mentioned that this began in the United States. In some ways, that's not surprising because the United States was the pioneer of the mass high school. By the 1930s, a majority of American adolescents go to a high school. That's never happened before in human history. And that's, of course, because of the Great Depression and they couldn't get jobs. And so it shouldn't surprise us that it began in the US, and it began during venereal disease outbreaks. Basically, in cities like Chicago and New York, middle-class men were patronizing prostitutes, which has always been the main conduit for STDs, and going home and infecting their wives. Of course, this happened in places like Paris and Berlin as well, but in Europe, what they did was they passed laws, regulating prostitution or banning it. But the United States, I think, characteristically had an educational solution. What we need to do is we have to teach kids in schools about the dangers of sex. And that's really where sex ed came from. And in that sense, we were the first, and Europe trailed very slowly. There was the first international conference on sex ed happened in the 1920s, and it was in Finland. And it was really fun to read about because the U.S. is there talking about how great their sex ed is, but the only problem is that the U.S. is also the place that has created mass electronic entertainment in the form of Hollywood. And all these movies that sex educators said were, spreading vice, doing the opposite of sex ed. And the European delegates point that out, and they pass this resolution saying, American films are making all of us behave in immoral ways. And the Americans get a little defensive, and they say, well, we admit it. Some of our movies encourage petting in automobiles. And then I love this. According to the record that I found, the European delegates said they did not understand what petting meant. And I've always had a hard time with that one, too. Like, what is it? Good doggy. Yeah. The automobile part, of course, is very important. If anybody tells you that America's not different, just look at automobile statistics. I mean, it's just astonishing. I mean, at the end of the 20s, 1 out of every 5 Americans has a car. And countries in Europe, it's 1 out of 200, 1 out of 300. So sex ed develops more slowly over there, and Sigmund Freud wrote an early essay about this in favor of sex ed, in which he said, as you might guess, children are sexual beings, but their parents feed them all these lies about sex, which makes them neurotic. And Freud wrote a lot about those lies, of course, and they were fun to read about in this book. The stork, by the way, the stork is everywhere. I mean, we found the stork on 5 continents. We don't know why. People have written long books about this. Some people think it's because a stork with a frog in its mouth looks like maybe like a baby. But in the UK, you get left under a gooseberry bush. In China, you get fished out of a river. And in Germany, you get excreted. Yeah. And Freud wrote about all this and said, look, this is why we need sex ed, to correct these ridiculous ideas. But he was sanguine about it, too. He said that's never going to happen as long as religion holds sway over the schools. And he says, quote, a priest will never admit that men and animals have the same nature. Now, here's the irony. Sex ed did address animals in the early 20th century. It just left out the human part. And some of you might remember this from your own youth, right? We want to teach about sex and about its dangers, but we don't want to make it more alluring than it already is, right? So the answer is to teach about animals, right? Freud's assuming that if we teach about animals, we'll kind of have this honest understanding of, well, the animal part of all of us, right? But no. What we do is we just teach the plants and animals and we leave out the human parts. So when they start doing this in the UK, I have this great account of this event in Wales where teacher is explaining, plant and animal reproduction, and a kid says, do babies grow the same way as seeds and plants? And the teacher says, oh no, babies grow more like chickens hatch, only it's not nearly such a beautiful process and I don't want to talk about it now. So again, Freud thinks that studies of animals and plants are going to lead to kind of a frank, matter-of-fact acceptance of human sexual nature, but in practice it did the opposite. So, plant and animal sex, that's natural, that's positive, that's beautiful. The human part, much more problematic. Freud isn't wrong in some ways. I mean, one of the reasons that sex ed spreads very slowly in Europe is a lot of the school systems, are still run by ecclesiastical, by religious organizations. Pope Pius IX did devote an encyclical in 1929 to the evils of sex ed, which is interesting. He didn't pull any punches either. Listen to this. There are many people who in their stupidity proclaim this dangerous educational method known under the disgusting name of sex education. These people are wrong. Youth fall into the sin of unchastity not so much because of lack of knowledge as because of a weak will, exposed to temptation and deprived of God's help. So Freud's not wrong about that. Religious organizations are allied against this, but, there's a more interesting set of objections that just comes from citizens. Basically, the more that democracy spreads in Europe, the more sex ed becomes condemned and contested. George Bernard Shaw, believe it or not, gave a talk about this. One of the fun things about this project is it's kind of like Forrest Gump, like everyone runs through it. Everyone has an opinion about sex ed, so you're just reading along, you're like, whoa, there's George Bernard Shaw. But Shaw gave an address. He was himself a supporter of sex ed. He gives an address to a bunch of sex educators, and he says, you sex educators assume that what makes for liberty in one thing will make for liberty in all things. And then he says, no, don't think our own particular morality can be imposed on the whole nation. And don't dream that such liberality is inherent in democracy. The more the people at large can influence the government, the more they will restrict sex education. So don't assume that people agree with you. And the more voice you give to people, the more they might end up disagreeing with you. And Freud, near the end of his life, writes one more piece about sex ed with a totally different tone. You've probably read, he was exiled because of Nazism, ended up in England and had an extremely painful death, cancer of the jaw. And one of the last things he wrote was about sex ed, and he says, quote, the prophylactic effect of this liberal measure has been vastly overestimated. You can't make this up. I wanted that to be the title of my book. But they said it was, too long and boring. But it works, right? The prophylactic effect of this illiberal measure has been vastly overestimated. He says, children aren't ready to sacrifice the sexual theory of the stork. That these ideas are too deeply ingrained for school to affect. Which turns out to be one of the themes of my book as well. The conclusion is called Sex Ed and the Limits of School. Those of us who work in and near schools, we're very biased on the question of what schools can do because we want to matter. right? But I think one of the things my book shows is just how limited the effect of school can be in a realm that is this intimate, and I think that was Freud's point. Moving very quickly, through the years, after World War II, the United States continues to be kind of the dominant force in this realm, but it gives it a new name. It's called family life education. And there are American organizations that are spreading family life education around the world as a Cold War endeavor. Family strength is world strength. Family life education will make the warring countries into the family of man and the household of the world. And here, there's a little different emphasis because, as per the name, you're going to see the first really frank acknowledgement of human sexuality, right, provided it's within the marital union. Right? The idea of family life education is husband and wife, that's what they do, right? And we'll talk about that, right? But the corollary is, right, anything that isn't that, right, is tabooed. These are the same years that in Western Europe we see this new alternative that I alluded to earlier popping up. And the leader is Sweden. Sweden becomes the first country to require sex education nationwide in 1956. I did a lot of research on this book in Sweden, which was really fun. The Swedes know that only Swedes speak Swedish, so everything there is in English. And the woman who was the founder of sex ed in Sweden is on postage stamps. She was the 17th of 18 kids born to a Norwegian family. Her only younger sibling got pregnant and committed suicide. She married a Swede and ended up in Stockholm pushing for this sex ed. But the emphasis, I think, is really captured in one of kind of her early statements on this subject. They said, why sex ed? And she says, to make people of all ages relieved of their inhibitions and anxieties. She says, sex ed will eliminate ignorance and prejudice, neuroses and sexual disharmonies. So the goal is individual dignity, individual pleasure. And I had a real aha moment in the archives in Sweden when I realized this. If you do work like this, if you've ever done it, sometimes you feel like you're going insane, like you have these ideas, but they're just in your head, and then finally you actually see it. Well, this is when I saw it. I was in the archives of the RFSU, which is the Swedish sex ed organization. I won't try to say it in Swedish because, of course, to us it looks like an eye chart. An educator from Ireland, very conservative country at the time, writes a letter like my mom would have written to the sex ed organization in Sweden. Basically, why do you rock so much? Why are you so awesome, right? Why are your teen pregnancy rates so low? Why are your abortion rates so low? Why are your STD rates so low? And the guy in charge, by this time the founder was dead and it was his replacement. The guy in charge writes back a very nice letter saying, thanks for your note. Then he says two things. He says, you're right. Those rates are lower here, much lower than in places like Ireland and the US and the UK. But we don't know if that's because of sex ed, right? That's number one. And they don't, right? And then more interestingly, number two, he says, and by the way, that's not the point. He says, of course, nobody wants unwanted pregnancy or STDs among teens. But he says, the fundamental reason for sex ed is the right to knowledge and pleasure, not ideas about effects. It's a very different orientation. And it becomes quite prominent in international organizations by the 70s and 80s. And I'll just give you my favorite example. The World Health Organization in 1983 passes a sex ed resolution. And this is really rich. It says, at present, it's not possible to define the totality of human sexuality in a form that would be acceptable to all countries. But every person has a right to receive sexual information and accept sexual relationships for pleasure as well as procreation. Friends, this is a contradiction that a third grader can see through, right? I mean, the premise and the conclusion don't match, right? The premise was you can't define human sexuality in a way that would apply to all countries, and then they do, right? Then they say, everyone has a right to receive sexual information, have sexual relationships for pleasures, procreation. And it went on, masturbation is normal, right? But children suffer from sexual repression. And then, because it's WHO, they have to have a goal. And this I love. It says, by 1995, this would be 12 years later, in every country of the earth, 80% of people will have the opportunity of leading an emotionally satisfying sexual life. I mean, as my daughters would say, WTF. What is that? I mean, does that just mean like you get a lot? Right? I mean, I'm not saying that you don't have an understanding of what that is. I'm sure everybody does at some level, right? I'm questioning whether there could be any normative or shared understanding of that, what that term means, given everything we know about human diversity. Emotionally sad, what is that? I mean, I think it's probably different in every culture and within every culture. But that becomes one of the dominant norms in international sex ed. Right? This idea that sex ed should help individuals, especially liberate themselves from repressive ideas. But what it does, of course, is it creates a kind of counter-revolution. And a big theme of my book is that, again, sex ed is global, but so is the opposition to sex ed. And starting in the UK, interestingly, in the 1960s, a woman named Mary Whitehouse becomes quite prominent fighting sex ed. And if you grew up in the 70s like me, you might remember that name because it's in a Pink Floyd song. It's in Animals. There's this line, I won't sing it, hey you White House, charade you are, you got to stem the evil tide and keep it on the inside. Well, I've got Mary Whitehouse coming to America in the 70s and meeting with Jerry Falwell, Phyllis Schlafly, Paul Weyrich, going to Australia and New Zealand and meeting with kind of the new right people down there. And challenging this idea, especially, that schools should be liberating the individual, in the sexual realm. So moving much closer into the present, the AIDS crisis in the 80s changes everything for sex ed in this country and around the world. Basically, before HIV, there were people who were against sex ed and people who were for it. After the AIDS crisis, everyone's for it, right? Phyllis Schlafly's for sex ed, right? She's just for a different kind, this thing that's sometimes called abstinence-only education. You'll find almost nobody on any part of the political spectrum that says that schools shouldn't address sex, which was the Mary Whitehouse position. What happens is in the developing world, which had resisted sex ed before this time, you see it too, almost every nation state develops some kind of sex ed, but it's not the Swedish kind. So just to give the example of Ghana, where I've done a lot of research because I teach over there, when they start sex ed in Ghana, I found some of the textbooks, and this is what they say. The biological aim of sex ed is to vindicate the existence of the omnipotent. Our religious restrictions are strict, but they protect a person from a lot of problems. Then another textbook. Sexually active teens become disrespectful, indulge in drug abuse, gambling, stealing, truancy, homosexualism, abortion, and death. But there are some bad things too. Right? It's not all peaches and cream. Another textbook, young men must resist internet pornography. If they cannot, they should turn to God in prayer. The Swedes did try to promote their version of sex ed around the world, and it mostly fell on deaf ears. Because in countries like Ghana and in most of the post-colonial and developing world, the idea of adolescents being autonomous sexual actors is just anathema. And then things get really interesting, and here comes the globalization part. Of course, starting in the 80s, a lot of people moved from the developing world to the West. I mean, they had done that forever, of course, but there are new waves, especially in Western Europe, especially from North Africa, Middle East, South Asia. And these people bring relatively conservative ideas to these countries and make sex ed an extremely contentious question. When I was in Sweden, I discovered there are 10 million people there, and now 1 million were born in another country. Sweden is fractionally a more immigrant society than we are now. But it's all of extremely recent vintage. And a lot of those people object to the Swedish version of sex ed. And this happens in, almost all the Western European countries. So in the UK, you find Muslim organizations protesting sex ed, boycotting, keeping their kids out of school. Just to give you a sense of the objections, quote, sex education reflects the decadence of Europe. In our culture, adultery is condemned by stoning to death. And you find in the UK these new immigrant groups uniting with some of the conservative Tories in Parliament, which is really interesting because they don't agree on anything else, right, including immigration itself. But in this, they do. In Holland, you see the same thing. You see people from Morocco uniting with kind of these rural Pentecostals in the so-called Bible Belt of Holland. So these societies are not, uniform. They're not homogenous. I mean, the other thing Mom taught me is, Sweden has it easy because, like, everyone there is, like, descended from the same, like, 1,000 Vikings. That may have been roughly true at some point in the past. It's not true anymore. So you have what's inevitably described as this strange bedfellow effect, right? There's no account of this I've ever found that doesn't use the term strange bedfellow in these societies. And then you also see these new global configurations. You see organizations like the World Congress of Families, and they bring together representatives from the Vatican, representatives from different Muslim countries, some majority Catholic countries in Central America, and Russian Orthodox, all objecting to sex ed. So just to conclude here, why is there so much resistance to sex ed? The hardest part, again, of writing this book is kind of like the Seinfeld thing. How do you make a show about nothing, right? How do you write a book about something that happens so rarely? Why did it happen so rarely? Just to conclude, I think there are a couple of kind of important reasons. First of all is, again, the lack of a strong scientific consensus about its effect. And just to be clear, there is some research showing that some programs do have a positive effect on teen behavior, but I think it's fair to say they're few and far between, and the evidence is still, again, really weak. One of the things that people like, my mom will say is, the people that object to sex ed, they're like climate change deniers or anti-evolutionists. Actually, they're not, because you know what? Evolution is science. It's the heart of biology, right? And human-made climate change is science too, even though we might have disagreements about its degree and everything else, right? And, that makes it different from sex ed. I mean, the three countries in Europe in 2009 with the lowest teen pregnancy rates were Italy, Switzerland, and Holland. They all had totally different approaches to sex ed. And the Italian one, by the way, was appalling. It's like 2 hours a year, and half of the 11 to 14-year-olds think you can get AIDS from a toilet seat. I mean, there's all kinds of ridiculous stuff. But their teen pregnancy rate is tiny, which should tell you that sex ed is not the relevant variable here, right? So that's one thing. And then, the limits of school itself, especially compared to mass media. For 100 years, we've been trying to use schools to kind of temper or control or catch up with mass media. But mass media is so much more powerful in this realm than schools are, especially now when we know the kids are in front of screens so much more than they're in class. It's rare you can get anyone to say this, but I found my favorite quote in the whole book, this principal in the US in the 80s. He says, "A 12-minute film strip is no match for 2 years of R-rated movies every weekend." Remember, this is like before the internet and all that, right? He says, "The school plays Stars and Stripes Forever, the school band, but the students listen to Afternoon Delight on their cassette recorders." And Afternoon Delight was this terrible pop song from my youth, but it's about sex in the afternoon. And then he says, "Schools are a puny David without even a slingshot against the media Goliath." I think that's actually ever more true because of the changing nature of the media. And then I just think, dissent about the nature of the individual itself, especially with respect to sexuality. The Swedes did try to spread their version around via their version of AID. And I found this great account by this Swedish guy who had gone to Latin America. And he's trying to promote his version of sex ed. And he writes, "It's hard for people to be autonomous in cultures where autonomy seems to be of such little use." This is sexual autonomy. He says, "To many people around the world, the goal of individual freedom insults their religions and their communities that don't leave sex up to the individual." And then finally, this movement of people and ideas around the globe, it's become, just so rapid, the way not just people, but the way images and ideas move. I think that's become an enormous challenge for this subject. And in closing, the Swedish sex ed organization released this pamphlet in 2004 called A Passion for Rights, which you can't make up. I love that title, A Passion for Rights, because it contains so much. And it really asks the question of the book. It says, how can a sexuality, reproduction, and health perspective based on individual rights and freedoms become a global norm? I don't know if it can or even if it should, but I hope the book will help us find out. Thanks a lot.
No, it's fantastic. And I always love your pop culture threads. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks.
So, Jonathan, first question. I mean, most of education debate today is about measures of student achievement in reading and math, or graduation rates. So, what got you interested in this?
Well, again, I mean, and embarrassingly, it's because of my mom. You know, I mean, the book is dedicated to her. And to be clear, I have an enormous respect for, you know, what she did in her career and what she taught me. But, you know, one of the things that my students are accustomed to me hearing, to me saying is, this isn't about me. I had one class actually where the students made T-shirts that said, this isn't about me. My mom gave me, I think, an outstanding sex education. I think I can share it with you. When I was 15 or 16, this is in the mid-'70s, she brings home this big box of condoms, and she says, I don't know what you and your friends are doing, but if it involves that, it's going to have to involve this. And you know, I will tell you that being a kid in the 70s, I did a lot of dumb things that I hope my kids haven't done, but probably have. But the one thing I didn't do was have unprotected sex. And there must be a reason for that. So it worked for me. But again, it's not about me. You know, I think that some people hear a story like that and they say, well, then it works, right? That's what we should do for everybody. It works for you, right? But I think the point is that in a world of such incredible diversity and flux, we can't have a single kind of sex ed. And hopefully the book helps us explore how that diversity makes sex ed such just contended and problematic. I'm not against sex ed. I think some people have read my columns in the paper and said, well, you don't want sex ed? No, that's not the point. What I'm trying to do is understand it, understand its cultural dimensions, and understand why it's been so contended and contested.
Hey, but you know, I mean, one of the interesting things here is you're a historian who actually has tried to bring that to bear on real conversations beyond the academy. So we're inside the Beltway here. Folks in Washington are talking a lot about No Child Left Behind and teacher quality and standards. Are there, and they say, well, this is interesting. It's some of these stories you share are wild.
Yeah.
But does it have any relevance to these ongoing conversations?
I think it does, and here's why. You know, I think often what gets left out of the contemporary conversation is the fact that schools actually are our central public institution for deliberating and transmitting the values we want to transmit to our young, you know? And schools are always transmitting values, whether we say so or not. No Child Left Behind embodies a huge set of different values, right? As do the different programs of the people that have criticized No Child Left Behind. But I think sometimes, you know, those values in that discussion are kind of submerged. You can't really see them. But I think in the case of sex ed, you can see them loud and clear. You know, they're right on the surface. Okay, what are we as human beings? Are we sexual beings inherently? By what age? Who should decide the sexual future of a young person? Their parent, their teacher, themselves? What is the purpose and the role of school in people's lives? You know, I think these are fundamental questions, but in our current debate, often you can't see them, even though they're there. With sex ed, though, they're right there. They're right on the surface.
So, you know, we've got some folks with us who, you know, were in a high school in the last decade. There's others of us who have been in high school since, you know, at least as students, since the last century. Well, what does sex ed look like today?
Well, you know, it's funny you say that because, you know, I wrote this book short on purpose because I wanted people to read it. And therefore, there's a lot of generalizing in it. I mean, you can't write without generalizing, right? If you want to get really dreamy, every noun is a generalization, right? A mammal includes a whale and a person and a dog. But you know, even in the United States, it's hard to generalize because there are 14,000 school districts, you know? But I do think it's fair to say, when you look at American sex ed in a comparative realm, it's still very oriented towards dangers and avoiding them, avoiding negative consequences. You know, it is true that we have a serious teen STD and unwanted pregnancy problem in this country. There's no contesting that. But the majority of sex ed in this country is oriented towards that, to try to reduce it. So it's what I would call a defensive posture, right? Kids, here's what you don't want to do.
And is that taught by teachers standing up front and telling them stuff? Is it video clips? Is it, how do they do this?
Again, you know, it varies, but a lot of it is still taught by the gym teacher. The reason for that historically is that phys ed has generally been gender segregated, right? And it was thought, especially in the early 20th century, that there was no way you could discuss this subject in coeducational realms. So that's how it got shunted to the phys ed teacher, and that's who taught me. You know, actually, he taught me nothing, but we'll leave that for another. You know, actually, that's the other consistent theme. You say, how does sex ed happen? It's still quite brief on the average in this country. You know, a total of 5 to 10 hours often per year. You know, spread out over a bunch of different gym classes or sometimes biology classes, very rarely social studies classes. But the one constant that I think runs through the history of sex ed in our country and in others, including Sweden, is that the kids think it's a joke. So when I said I learned nothing from the phys ed teacher, that's true. I mean, I learned, like most other people do, from screens, from my peers, and in my case, from my parents, which some people don't. But one of the fun things about doing this book is that there are jokes about sex ed in every country. And you don't have to be Freud to understand why that would be so. And the one from Sweden, I think, is very illustrative of what I'm saying. In Sweden, it starts in 3rd grade. It's nationwide. So the joke goes, teacher gets in front of the room. The 8-year-old says, "Good morning, class. Today we're going to have our first sex ed unit." And a kid in front, he's 8, he raises his hand and he says, "Miss, can those of us who already know how to go out and play football?" And he uses the F word. And of course, you know, it's a joke, and the joke is on the adults, right? And all of these jokes are on the adults. So the one from Mexico I like, you've got a son and his dad, and they're walking on the street, and the dad says, "You know, son, it's time we talked about, you know, that sex thing." And the boy kind of sighs, and he says, "Okay, Dad, what do you want to know?" So, you know, it is brief in most parts of the world, even in places, again, like Sweden, that, you know, we tend to think it goes on and on. It's pretty restricted there for a variety of reasons. And the kids, almost everywhere, when you survey them, they think, what? School is always behind. It's always lagging in some way in the view of the kids.
So do we have data on where students actually learn this stuff?
We do.
And what do we know about that?
Mass media and peers. And that's been really constant.
And how do they study that? How do we know what we know on this?
Well, it's mostly surveys, but some of them are pretty sophisticated. And the thing I find so interesting is how constant they've been. So starting in the 20s, you know, in the era of kind of big Hollywood, right? That was the era of, you know, Rudy Valentino and Greta Garbo, who were from Italy and Sweden, respectively, so they were allowed to do things on the screen that American actors you kind of couldn't do. But that's where people got their information. And although the screen has changed, right, and what's on it, I think that's remained constant. Peers, a lot. Parents, a little more. There's some indication in the United States and in other places that, you know, the box check parents, you've gone up a little bit, but what's remained constant is school, between 5 and 10%. You know, when you say to kids, you know, what's the most important, you know, institution or set of, set of people or communities that's teaching you about, you know, it's a tiny minority check the school box.
And
that isn't where it happens.
and so what does that mean? I mean, in the era of the internet, of, you know, obviously all kinds of materials available online.
Yeah.
How does this play out in terms of youth behavior and what kids think about this stuff?
Well, look, I mean, I think that, schools again are in the realm of trying to catch up. And I should be clear that I don't object to that. There's a lot of really nasty stuff on the internet. And when I say nasty, I mean two things. Some of it horribly violent and graphic, and some of it just inaccurate, right? Some of it, both of those things. Should schools try to counter those images and try to critique them? I absolutely think they should. But I'm also sanguine about their ability to do so, because I think historically they've never really been able to do so. Also because, again, especially in the U.S. where there's so much local control, I think there's going to be so much contention about any kind of discussion of these subjects. But I do think they should try. I mean, I'm appalled at some of the things that kids have access to on the internet, and I support the idea of schools saying, hey, what are you watching, and what's that telling you? About gender, about love, about sex. But I also know that there are plenty of people that don't want that discussion happening in our classrooms. So that's our dilemma.
Do we know what percentage of teens are going into some of this really inappropriate or graphic material? Or?
It's hard. I mean, I've seen a bunch of different numbers, but the vast majority of adolescent boys watch internet porn. And I have to say, I'm really glad that didn't exist when I was a teen, because I would have watched it for sure. And I think it would not have been good for me. I mean, when I was a 16-year-old young man growing up in the United States, I wanted to see naked female flesh. I don't think I was alone in that. And what we did was we found magazines and things like that, and now you can just click. It isn't just that it's naked. That's not what I find personally troubling. What I find are some of the violent images that attach to it, and the message that are sent to young men especially about what sex is and its connection to violence. And so I'm deeply troubled by that, and I support the effort of any school to try to discuss that and to try to expose some of those connections, which are, again, I think, really nefarious and really troubling.
One of the things that you talk about is this notion of one vision of sex education is to liberate children from societal norms,
right?
So they can decide for themselves.
Right.
Another mission of schooling, as you've written about at length, obviously, is to impart societal norms.
Right.
How does this play out?
Well, I think that in the United States, the way it plays out is, unfortunately, in my view, we have a very hard time acknowledging what I would just call the pleasure principle. So you go into a lot of American high school classrooms, and they'll have a lesson that says, why do teens have sex, right? And they'll list a bunch of things on the board, and I've seen these lessons over and over again. Peer pressure, wanting to fit in, wanting to get a boyfriend. And I'm always in the back, and I was going to raise my hand and say, because it feels good, right? Apparently it does, but that's always been, I think, a huge taboo in American sex ed. I think it goes way back because the original purpose was to control these impulses. So if you start talking about pleasure, it seems to run perpendicular to that goal. I don't think there's anything inconsistent about acknowledging the pleasurable aspects of sex and also emphasizing some of the dangers that can attach to it. I see nothing inconsistent about that, but I think that because a lot of people see them as perpendicular, it's difficult for schools to do both of them at the same time.
And it strikes me that, some of what you address in this book obviously ties into these larger conversations about school choice, about purpose of schooling, that to the extent that schools are trying to liberate children from societal norms, there's disagreement about what kind of liberation and from which norms.
Right.
So what does that mean in terms of policy prescriptions? If school board members or state policymakers or say, well, gosh, how do we try to square some of these tensions?
Right. I mean, I think the connection to school choice is really interesting because obviously, school choice, a lot of it revolves around a concept of parental or familiar sovereignty, right? I mean, who's choosing? Not the state, right? Not the school district. You are, Rick Hess and, and your family, your kid, right? I think that that's a deeply inscribed notion, right, in American education. And it's been one of the inhibitors, ironically, of sex ed. And it kind of goes back to George Bernard Shaw's comment. The more democracy you have, right, the more voices, the more people you're going to hear objecting. Now, in fairness, and the sex educators often point this out, if you look at the poll literature, most American parents support sex ed in schools. Now, of course, they disagree about what that sex ed should be, right? And I think many, many people who check that box of supporting sex ed would probably object if the teacher started asking the kids what pleasure was or what gives them pleasure. But I also think it's fair to say, as sex educators often do, that the opponents make the most noise. And I think across time in the United States and other countries, that's been the case too. So there's a lot at play there. We believe that parents should be able to choose, right? A lot of parents want sex ed, but they disagree about what that means. And then you've got the school board and the school district, right, trying to make sense of all of that. It's really hard. And I have enormous admiration for the people that have to keep all these balls in the air.
Is there any country that you think is, found particularly interesting ways for the policy community to wrestle with this?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think, frankly, countries of the West are becoming more like each other in the sense that they're all becoming multicultural and they're all becoming battle zones on this issue. I mean, my mom wasn't wrong when she told me in the 60s and 70s that Sweden, it was fairly monochrome, it was fairly united. And so they had a kind of advantage in a way that the United States didn't have because they didn't have so many different kind of cultural mores competing with each other. That's no longer the case. So I would say in a weird way, as the globe has become more diverse, in some ways it's become more unitary insofar as all of the countries are facing the same dilemma, which is, what do we do with all these different points of view? In the US context, it strikes me as quite ironic that often the same-sex educators who call themselves liberal and want a kind of very liberal sex ed also call themselves multiculturalists, right? And they want to celebrate diversity, and they get kind of beautiful integrity of all these different groups. Well, it's going to be hard to square that too, when some of those groups don't agree with any of your presuppositions about liberal sexuality.
So one last question, let's open it up. I'm curious, just you want to say a bit about what is sex education? How does it play out, say, in China or in the nations of the Arabian Peninsula?
Well, the Chinese story is just utterly fascinating, and I could go on at great length, but just to summarize, Zhou Enlai, who was kind of Mao Zedong's lieutenant, as it were, he was one of the early supporters of sex ed, and he tried to promulgate in the schools, but Mao interrupted it. Mao thought that any mention of sex in schools would divert people from the revolution. And this was kind of the line in the Soviet Union after Lenin as well. But then after Mao, they promulgate the one-child policy, and things get very complicated because what you're doing essentially is you're asking people to delay marriage, right? And there are going to be more reproductive years in which you're not reproducing. And the state realizes this, and they say, God, we're going to have some sex ed in schools because, we're asking people who formerly got married at a very young age to put that off. And we've got to explain that and explain what this is. And so China required sex ed starting in the early 80s, and a lot of the schools resisted and still do. even in a country that, in many ways to us is quite totalitarian, like the one-child policy would illustrate, when it comes to sex ed, a couple things happen. Teachers said that the kids wouldn't respect them if they talked about this. And the other thing, more recently, they said is the parents won't like this, not necessarily because it's immoral, but because it diverts you from the Gaokao, the big test at the end of the year, And another reason why sex ed hasn't happened around the world is in most countries of the world, the only thing anyone pays attention to is what's on the national test, right? And if it's not on the Gaokao, as they say in China or whatever it's called in another country, no one's really going to listen. Yeah.
All right. Let's go ahead and open this up. If folks have questions, just catch Rooney or Elizabeth's eye. Please be kind enough just to introduce yourself by name and affiliation.
Max Eden, AEI. One theme that came up a couple of times, the tension between the family and the school, the state. One kind of hears the refrain often again, on and again, that it's not the school's business, it's really the responsibility of the family, which has kind of struck me as funny every time I've heard it, because I wonder, do they really mean that?
Yeah.
So what, as you researched, what interesting things popped up about the tension? Is there data that suggests some sort of change in parental attitudes? How do parents really feel about kind of relinquishing this to whatever degree?
Well, I think Max's question is a really fundamental one, and I think one way of thinking about it historically is that, it's an odd objection because schools have always existed to compensate for what families don't do. If you go back to, Puritan New England, the first laws say, okay, look, you have to teach your kid how to read so they can read scripture, all right? But if you don't, you got to send them to school. Right? So there you see the compensation, right? If they already know, if you've already done it, that's cool, right? But if you haven't, they got to go to this other place, right? And, I can't teach my kid calculus, right? My wife could actually, but I can't, right? There are lots of things I can't do, right? And school compensates for that. And I think we understand that until we get into some of these, again, very personal and very intimate zones. And I do think that there's a lot of sentiment in this country and other places that that's simply a place that schools shouldn't go. So you look at the United Nations Charter of Rights after World War II, and one of the things I love about this is that people on the right in this country tend to be very dismissive of the UN, not all of them, but many of them, except for this one passage in the Declaration of Rights, which says parents have a prior right over the education of their kids. That's the one thing in the UN, right? Over and over again. I just saw it everywhere I looked. And it's often invoked in precisely this realm. So I think schools have always existed to compensate for what families don't do, but there are some realms that are so, to use a loaded adverb, intimately tied to our just basic values, religious and moral, that people object to the schools intruding.
Right here.
Rick is calling.
Right here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I want to begin by saying...
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, my name is Barbara Dello, and I'm a nurse, and I actually was a school nurse for a while, so I have a little bit of experience with girls coming in crying. So anyway, and my personal experience is very different from yours because I came from a kind of strict Catholic background, and to this day I'm shy about taking my clothes off, but my husband and I seem to have managed because I have 7 children. So anyway, I was wondering about the results, and this kind of goes along with what you say, though it's not directly related to the education because there are other factors, but in my lifetime, I'd seen a tremendous change in the sexual mores in society and the idea of kind of the right to sexual expression and freedom. And I've, as a school nurse, I've seen, like, I remember girls crying after abortions and saying, one girl said, I could feel the baby, now I can't feel it anymore, and the tears are streaming down in her face. And I haven't done studies. And I've also noticed there's a tremendous increase in divorce rate. And I wonder if the studies have shown, because I don't know studies, if there's any correlation between, the idea of sexual expression being a good thing and you should be free to do it, and unlinking that from responsibility, and some of these breakdown of the family that we've seen.
Well, there's a lot in the question. I mean, just one minor point. I think that the divorce numbers show actually that there was a spike and then they flattened out. It's a myth that divorce is increasing in this country. It increased quite sharply during the women's revolution in the 60s and 70s, and then it kind of plateaued. But to take the kind of essence of your question, about the question of sexual morality. I mean, I think that the United States is a deeply divided place. I think it's true that if you look in certain forms of pop culture, and if you look at certain kinds of statistics, depending on which one you're quoting, you can tell a story about how kind of we've lost our moral core, right? But teen pregnancy rates have declined quite sharply in this country in recent years. No, I think unintended pregnancies have gone down as well. So I think the stories we tell, often I think for rhetorical purposes, we tell them as vectors, but they're usually sine and cosine waves. In Newport, Rhode Island, in the 1700s, 44% of children were born out of wedlock. Now, in fairness, most of the people that made those babies got married after they made them, right? But again, I think that's an illustration of how I think we have to resist the temptation of saying that, the sky's falling, and in the good old days, everyone hewed to a moral code, and then it all became undone. Because I think, as the Newport example illustrates, there have been teens getting pregnant and having babies for a long time. So I'm not sure that I buy the premise of the decline. I think that we, depending on the story we tell, there are a lot of waves, and it's rarely a straight line.
How much does the moral debate about abortion complicate conversations about sex education?
Well, that's a really good question, and again, it depends on the country. In the U.S., hugely so. And in the 60s and 70s, sex educators used to talk about the 4 things you can't talk about, and they were homosexuality, contraception, masturbation, and abortion. Abortion was probably the most hotly contested one, but masturbation also, and continues to be. I mean, if you don't want to read about masturbation, you shouldn't study sex education, because it comes up constantly. And the reason it does, of course, is that it's not procreative, right? I mean, it's only about pleasure. There's no other reason to do it, And so, again, I think it highlights exactly that dilemma, right? Are we going to talk about pleasure, or aren't we? But in the U.S., I think that abortion has been kind of a huge inhibitor on discussion, right? There are a lot of school districts that have said it can't be discussed, even though obviously it's occurring. But then in some other societies in Europe where it hasn't been as hotly contested a question, it's not as big a deal. But in America and Canada, it absolutely has been.
Rooney, right here. Oh, sure.
Thank you. My name is Evan Wilt. I'm from the Daily Caller. We've talked. I understand that this is a dialogue, and we're not going to come away with some groundbreaking conclusion. We're like, oh, we know how to solve the sexual education crisis in America. But in your research and in this message today, what's like the positive takeaway we can leave here with to say, this is what we know about sexual education now that we didn't in the past, and this is what we understand about it now that we didn't in the past, and what we can go forward as a country and as we continue to change policy in the future?
Well, I should tell you, Arun, that I study dead people. Like Rick mentioned, I live in the present. I care about the present, right? But I'm mostly an historian, so I'm always a little bit wary about predicting this weird thing called the future. But I do think that there are elements of hope in my book, and I think that one of the things that makes me hopeful is precisely the fact that we're having more open discussions about sex ed. And I think that, again, the reason I study schools, the reason I think they're important, is they are our most important public institution for deciding who we want to become. So whether sex ed works or not, in terms of its behavioral effects, I think that the dialogue itself, the debate itself, in my view, is hugely salutary, insofar as it brings us together, even as it reminds us of our differences. And I think that's one of the things school politics should do. So this flared in Ontario a couple weeks ago, and that's what I wrote about in my Times piece this week. We op-ed writers, we just crave the news peg, like the thing that happens that's exactly an illustration of what we write about. And this thing in Ontario, it's like I invented it. I mean, what happened was Ontario promulgated a new sex ed curriculum that was much more explicit, which included, discussions of contraception, discussion of abortion, and also this thing called sexting, which I think is hilarious because as if the kids don't know what that is already. Oh, thank you, Mr. Teacher, for telling me about sexting, right? Anyway, it created a big imbroglio up there. Some of the people complaining were members of evangelical Christian communities, but a lot of them were Muslim immigrants from, the Middle East and South Asia. And they made a Facebook page called Parents Against Sex Ed. And you go in there and it's people from all around the world. Now, whether you agree with their perspective or not, and I should tell you that in honesty, generally I don't, but again, this isn't about me. Even though I don't agree with their perspective, I think that the debate itself is hugely salutary because it reminds us of how diverse we are and how sometimes these differences are fundamental and may not actually, might be so basic that we can't come to a final conclusion. There's this sort of facile boutique multiculturalism that says that if we all celebrate difference, right, and we're all a big rainbow, then we're all going to get along somehow and we're all going to agree. I think that's really lame. And if you take multiculturalism seriously, what you're going to see is sometimes you're going to see areas of overlap, but sometimes you're just going to see areas like you think kids are sexual beings at birth, and I don't. And there's not going to be a compromise there.
And John, just to kind of build on this, I think it's a great question. Two things I think I've heard you say or write, so I'd like you to respond. One is that there's very little one thing we know today is that there's very little evidence that any of this stuff actually works the way it's supposed to, or the way we'd like it to.
Yeah.
A second is that given all of these real disagreements and this complexity, it makes sense for schools to be humble about how much they think they should teach. Is that a fair statement?
It's a totally fair statement, and the only thing that I would add to it, which is really a corollary of the second point, is that those of us who are educators have to acknowledge that education happens in lots of places other than school. I think one of the problems with the sex ed debate is it's too school-based. And it's fair to say that my book is part of that. I mean, it's about the debate over school-based sex ed. But precisely because we know that people get most of their sexual information from other places, I think that as a corollary to your second point of schools being humble, I think we also have to learn much more and when relevant, support much more efforts to have sex ed occur in other places. So there are some really promising initiatives of these internet-based kind of text chat services, where an adolescent who's wondering about how you get pregnant can, do the texting thing, right, and actually get, an informed answer. We also have some really interesting data about how certain TV shows have affected sexual behavior. The most interesting one is this new data about the teen mom shows. Because, when the Teen Mom show started, there was all this hand-wringing, oh God, this is promoting teen pregnancy, this is glorifying it. Well, I've seen a couple studies, and obviously they're still very nascent, suggesting that actually it had precisely the opposite effect. It had what Freud would call a prophylactic effect, that 16-year-old girls were watching the show and they were saying, hey, I don't want to be that. Like, that looks terrible. So, there are lots of institutions that educate. And in this realm, schools probably aren't the first place we should be looking. So that doesn't mean we should forswear sex education. I just think we should take a much wider view of it and think about all the other institutions that can promote it.
Does that imply that for those folks passionate about this, that a good investment might be, rather than a school program, getting somebody to build a program for MTV or VH1 that scares kids out of doing this stuff?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I would use the term scares kids out of it, but look, I do think there's a lot to be said, especially in this generation, because they are so screen bound, right? To go where they are. The kids are in front of screens more than they're in front of us. We know this, and we've known it for a long time. Just to be clear, though, I don't think that schools can or should wash their hands of this, because you know what? Sex is a part of human life, right? And it's a part of English class, it's a part of history class, it's a part of biology class. You can't understand Shakespeare without knowing something about sex, right? And you can't understand, American history and demography without knowing something about sex. So schools can't ignore it, but obviously in that statement, I'm making a statement about what I think, schools should do in this realm, and I know that not everyone agrees with it.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Right here.
Jason Richmeyer with National Review. One more question about the evidence, if you don't mind, because you said that to make a strong claim about sex ed's effects on anything is difficult.
Yeah.
But do we have anything to hang our hat on? Has there ever been a really solid study, a randomized controlled trial of sex ed in school?
There absolutely has been. And to be fair, the guy who devoted most of his life work to this, a very careful scholar who died recently, unfortunately, tragically, was a guy named Doug Kirby. And I think that, he's like the gold standard for this stuff. And before he died, Doug did one of these kind of meta studies where he looks at all of the studies that have been done and kind of throws out the bad ones, and he found that, there were some good programs that did seem to have a small behavioral effect. But again, the emphasis is some programs, because most of them seem to be worthless. Most of them did nothing. They didn't make kids have sex, they didn't make kids, behave responsibly. It's just they didn't have any effect. But there were Kirby found a limited number, and I think it's fair to look at those and see if they can be scaled up. Again, I want to be absolutely clear, especially because this is going to be out on the net. I'm not saying there's nothing schools can do. And I think schools should keep trying. Frankly, my view of school-based sex ed at this point is I favor it for the same reason that Pascal believed in God, right? That it's a good bet, right? Pascal said, look, you might as well, right? If you turn out to be wrong, no harm, no foul, right? But if you turn out to be right, you win the game. Right, and we do know that a lot of the claims about sex ed, making people profligate and hurting kids, right, are baseless. So it's not going to do any harm, and I think we should keep trying. And I think that was Kirby's view too. But we should also be sanguine about what it can accomplish, and we should be looking at the other realms that educate, because I think in the end they're probably more promising.
All right, Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was fun.
It's great to have you with us.
Yeah.
The book is available on Amazon. For those of you with us today, it's also available out here. You have a few minutes to chat with folks?
Absolutely. I'd be delighted.
Thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you.